Hello and welcome back to our learning of different regions in the world. We're going to stick with our topic of Central America and the Caribbean, and today we're going to focus on the history. So let's get started. Here are your vocab words. There are 6 of them. Some of them are going to look a little familiar. I'll be honest with you. We're going to talk a little bit about the Mayans coming up soon, and you're going to be like, we already learned about that group, and that's because they, were a big group in Mexico and also in parts of Central America. So a little overlap there, which should make this a little bit easier. So take your time right now. Pause me if you need to. Get down the vocab words, and we will move on. So going back to the Mayans, this is again a refresher, hopefully. They arrived in parts of southern Mexico, but also in Central America in the countries of Guatemala and Belize. And some of the greatest ruins you can go see are actually in some of these Central American countries. We know that they built many cities with thousands of people, that they created these pyramids that are still lasting, that they created the world's first calendar, and that they disappeared. And then we know that there's still some people living in parts of Central America today that are living the same way that the ancient Mayans lived. So early civilizations in the Caribbean were a little bit different because you had all these different islands. It wasn't like Central America where there's different small countries. And there was basically 2 Native American groups that made made some headway in the Caribbean during early history, and that was the Arawak tribe and the Carib tribe. And these groups would use canoes to go from island to island. They grew a variety of plants, gathered fruits, and they caught a lot of local shellfish and fish, and that's kind of how they survived. Each of these islands were ruled by local chiefs. The Arawaks eventually took kind of control as one of the major groups in early civilizations. So like what happened in Mexico, the Spanish are going to be one of the groups that's going to come over and start causing some havoc in Central America and the Caribbean. As we know, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. He was one of the first, but not the last, Spanish explorer to reach Central America and the Caribbean. And what we started to see was more explorers come over and then begin to colonize. And we talked about vocab words earlier. Colonize is to basically start your own expansion from a different country in a new area. Okay, so at first these explorers were looking for gold and riches. They're coming over just looking for things to take back. Then they started to want to kind of convert people to their ways of religion, which is Christianity. And then by the 1500s, people started kind of colonizing. The Spanish conquered a huge area, which is now current-day Panama, and set up a colony. And the native people there were not treated very well. So they were enslaved, many were enslaved, and then many died from disease or abuse. So the people came over, they did not take care of the locals. Large haciendas were created, and eventually the Spanish imported Africans, which we're going to talk about, to work on this new land, and that's where we see slavery and the triangle trade, slave trade begins. So slavery in the Caribbean. Other European countries developed their own colonies in the 1600s, and these colonies in the Caribbean and Central America grew cash crops such as sugar, because we know the geography in these areas is great for growing, and these are things that they couldn't grow in Europe. So these colonies would grow these types of crops in the Caribbean or Central America and then send them back to Europe. But there was a problem. The crops required many workers and a ton of land. So the Europeans had no problem getting the land. They just went over and took it over from the natives. But they didn't have the people to work it. So that's where you start to see slavery. Europeans began importing African slaves which began the triangular trade of slaves connecting the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa. And this made Europeans very, very rich. Hopefully you're seeing the theme here, and I know we don't get into slavery too much, and you will when you get into 8th grade, but it was really driven a lot by these rich European people who are trying to make more profit, and they began just kind of losing the sense of what was right and wrong, and slavery became very, very, very prominent in Central America and the Caribbean. Europeans controlled Central America and the Caribbean for the next 200 years. They set up many colonies, and basically they ruled this area of the world. But by the 1800s, unrest started to explode in the region. The natives that were still left were getting sick and tired of being controlled by the Europeans. Toussaint Louverture led a rebellion in Haiti, which led to their independence in 1804 from France, and that was one of the first that was to happen. In 1821, Guatemala declared independence from Spain, and by 1823, most countries in Central America had formed a united system, which eventually led to independent countries. So eventually these countries did kick out the Europeans, depending on outsiders. So after these countries became independent, they looked for foreign countries to help build their economies. They needed a way to make money. And many Central American and Caribbean countries depended greatly on the United States. Its close proximity and the need for the exports that the Caribbean and Central America could provide made the United States a very good trade partner. The United States built plantations and took over the sugar, coffee, and banana trade in the region. So the United States came over and kind of took over certain areas. They also gained control of land in Panama and built the Panama Canal. And if you take a look, here's the Panama Canal. And what the Panama Canal does, it's one of the biggest and greatest things to happen in this region is it opens up trade from the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. Okay, because before there was no way to trade. Okay, if I wanted to trade, let's say with people in California, I couldn't get there. There's no way, right? Because I'd have to go all the way around South America, come all the way back up around. With the Panama Canal, we could cut through, and it just increased trade throughout the entire region and really throughout the entire world. Although many of these countries in Central America and the Caribbean became independent countries, the problem was they had many of them unstable governments, which led to dictatorships. And we know a dictatorship is a one-man ruler, or they were ruled by few. And this is dangerous, obviously. Cuba, which was once led by Fidel Castro, ended relations with the United States. Some of these dictatorships didn't get along with the United States because of the differences in government. By the late 1900s, people in the region, though, began to fight back against dictatorship. So in a lot of these countries that were ruled by dictators for about 100 years, countries in Central America said, no, we don't, we want democracy. We want the people to have the power. Guatemala fought a 40-year civil war for their, independence and to have freedom. In the 1970s, people in Nicaragua removed the dictator, but unfortunately removed them and then added a new one. However, by the 1980s and 1990s, the last Caribbean colonies also at that time were granted their independence. So this area as well, and we're going to see when we look into current day, still has some instabilities with their governments because of their past, which have led to certain problems.